All right, so we're going to look at the active and passive voice very quickly, just to give everyone a bit of an idea. So before we get into anything ginormous about active voice and passive voice, it's necessary to talk about verbs and voice. So when I'm talking about voice, voice is a form of a verb taken to indicate whether the subject of the verb performs or receives the action. And there are two types of verb voice, and that's active and passive voice. Active voice means that a sentence has a subject that acts upon its verb. So you might think of it as Lucas played the guitar. Lucas is acting on the verb, whereas passive voice means that the subject is the recipient of the verb's action. So it's the opposite. The guitar was played by Lucas. Okay, so you may have learned that passive voice is weak and incorrect. The reality is that it's not. It's very much stylistic in when people are deciding whether or not they like it. It's stylistic, and it really looks at what are you trying to say and how are you trying to say it? And we're going to get into that. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. So the English grammar has 5 properties: voice, mood, tense, person, and number. And in this case, we're looking at voice. We're concerned with voice. And those are these 2 grammatical voices, active voice and passive voice. We're going to start with active voice. And I do encourage you guys, it might be helpful to take some notes as you go along to give yourself a bit more of an understanding as we go. So active voice. When the subject of a sentence, so usually the noun, okay, when the subject of the sentence performs the verb's action, we say that the sentence is in active voice. Sentences in active voice generally have very strong, very direct, and very clear tone. Okay, so if you've ever had a teacher ask you to write something clearly and concisely, this is really what they are referring to. They want a lot of active voice. And you'll notice that as we go through comparing active voice with passive voice, active voice generally results in less words, which is great when you're trying to write really concise responses. Okay, so an example of active voice: Marilyn mailed the letter. The object is receiving the action of the verb. In the phrase, Marilyn Mayer mailed the letter, what is the subject? Who knows? Active voice does indicates that the subject of the verb is acting. It's doing something. Okay? As the subject acts upon the verb in such sentences, the sentences are said to be in active voice. All right. Now, sometimes we're given situations where we have to convert the active into the passive. And this is going to be, we're going to have a few questions on this shortly. So in order to convert the active into the passive, you have to move the active's direct object into the sentence's subject slot. Okay, that's step 1. Step 2, you have to place the active sentence's subject into a phrase beginning with the preposition by. So Marilyn has now moved into this position here, right? We're now moving Marilyn. Okay, we've moved Marilyn. And now at the same time, the phrase beginning with the preposition by, we've moved it over here. So the subject is moving into that prepositional phrase. Then we add a form of the auxiliary verb to be to the main verb and change the main verb's form. So if we look here back at this explanation, we're seeing that there's a main verb and there's also a helping verb. The auxiliary verb to be, all right, in this case, is that helping verb. So what's the main verb in the letter was mailed by Marilyn? The main verb is to mail something, right? That makes sense. But we now have this auxiliary verb, this helping verb, to be, by. And there's 23 of them. Here's a few. Am, is, are, was. If you are seeing any of these verbs, guys, it's a good indicator you're writing in passive voice. And if you don't mind writing in passive voice, you're not trying to do something concisely, then that's fine. But if you're noticing that you're using would or was or had or does or do, whatever, that's an indicator of passive voice. Doesn't mean it for sure, but it gives you an idea that it's a possibility.